There's a specific kind of morning that changes everything, and it never looks the way people expect it to. No dramatic exit, no slammed door, no final speech where everything finally gets said. Just a quiet, ordinary morning where a super empath, someone who has spent years absorbing, forgiving, explaining away, and holding an entire relationship together with nothing but their own capacity to love harder than the damage being done to them, wakes up, looks at everything clearly for what feels like the first time, and simply doesn't reach for their phone to check if the narcissist is okay. That's it. That's the whole moment. And if you understand what it actually took to get there, you'll understand why that small, undramatic morning is one of the most significant psychological shifts a human being can go through. Here's what almost nobody explains about the difference between a super empath leaving and anyone else leaving a relationship with a narcissist. Most people who leave in crisis, in the heat of the worst moment, in a burst of anger or fear, or finally reaching a breaking point that overrides everything else for just long enough to get out the door. That kind of leaving is real and valid, but it's also fragile, because it's driven by an emotional peak that eventually fades, which is exactly why so many people who leave that way end up going back. A super empath's final departure is different, fundamentally different, because it doesn't happen in crisis. It happens after crisis, long after, once the nervous system has finally, slowly, painstakingly rewired itself out of the patterns that kept pulling them back every single time before. So today, we're going to walk through exactly what that entire journey looks like. From the earliest cracks in the loyalty that used to feel unbreakable, all the way to that final, quiet morning. Because understanding this arc is going to completely change how you think about what real, permanent healing from a narcissist actually requires. Let's start with what makes a super empath different from someone with ordinary empathy in the first place, because this distinction matters enormously for understanding everything that follows. A super empath isn't just someone who's kind, or someone who feels bad when others are hurting. A super empath is someone whose entire emotional architecture is built around depth, around feeling things fully, around an almost bottomless capacity to understand, forgive, and hold space for another person's pain, often at direct cost to their own well-being. This isn't a flaw. In a healthy relationship, this capacity becomes one of the most extraordinary gifts one person can offer another. But in a relationship with a narcissist, that same bottomless capacity becomes something the narcissist learns, consciously or not, to depend on completely, because a super empath doesn't just tolerate more than most people would tolerate. They actively find reasons to keep believing, keep hoping, keep interpreting cruelty as pain the narcissist hasn't processed yet. Keep seeing potential in someone who has given them almost nothing real to base that potential on, beyond the fragments they've chosen to hold on to. This is why the first stage of this entire journey, the stage before any real movement toward leaving begins, is what I'd call the overextension phase, and it can last years, sometimes decades. During this phase, the super empath isn't just staying because they're afraid to leave. They're staying because leaving genuinely doesn't feel like an option their own value system allows for. If they love someone, and they truly, deeply do, then leaving during hard times feels like abandonment, like a betrayal of everything they believe love is supposed to mean. So instead of leaving, they give more. They try harder. They read more books about attachment styles and trauma responses, hoping if they just understand enough, they can finally reach the person underneath the behavior. They absorb blame that was never theirs to carry, because absorbing blame feels more bearable than accepting the alternative, that maybe there is no version of this person capable of meeting them the way they've been meeting the relationship this entire time. The second stage is what I'd call the awakening flicker, and this is where the first real cracks begin to show, though they're often so small, so easy to dismiss, that most people don't even recognize them as the beginning of anything significant. This might be a single moment where, for just a few seconds, the empath sees the situation with unusual clarity, not through the lens of, how can I fix this, but through the lens of, wait, why am I the only one trying? It might come after a particularly cruel comment that, for whatever reason, doesn't get absorbed and explained away the way 100 similar comments before it did. It might come from an outside source, a friend finally saying something that lands differently than it has before, a book or a video that describes their exact situation with such uncomfortable accuracy that denial becomes just slightly harder to maintain. These flickers rarely lead to immediate action. In fact, they're often followed by an intense wave of guilt, a rush back into justifying and defending, because seeing clearly, even for a moment, threatens the entire framework the superempath has built their identity around, and threatening that framework even briefly is deeply destabilizing. The third stage is the oscillation phase, and this is, without question, the longest, most exhausting part of the entire journey, the part that can stretch on for years, sometimes cycling through the same pattern dozens of times before anything permanent shifts. This is where the superempath starts to see clearly more often, starts to set boundaries, sometimes even starts to leave, only to be pulled back in through hoovering, through moments of apparent vulnerability from the narcissist, through their own residual hope that maybe this time, this version of them, this apology, this promise, is finally the real one. Each cycle through this oscillation phase looks, from the outside, like the same mistake being repeated over and over. But here's what's actually happening underneath the surface, and it's crucial to understand this correctly. Each cycle isn't actually identical to the one before it. Each time the empath leaves and comes back, they retain a small amount of clarity that didn't fully exist before, a small crack in the old belief system that doesn't fully close again, even when everything else seems to reset. This is why the oscillation phase, frustrating and painful as it is to live through, and honestly to witness from the outside, is not actually wasted time. It's slow, incremental erosion of a belief system that took years to build, and that erosion, however gradual, is genuinely, quietly, laying the groundwork for something that will eventually become permanent. The fourth stage is where things start to shift in a much more noticeable way, and I'd call this the exhaustion of hope, though I want to be careful with that phrase, because it's not the same thing as despair. This is the point where the superempath's hope doesn't disappear all at once, but it finally, gradually, stops being renewable in the same way it used to be. Where before, each apology, each small gesture of remorse, each moment of apparent vulnerability could reset the entire emotional investment back to full capacity, at this stage, that renewal starts to weaken. The apologies still happen, the gestures still come. But something in the empath has started to recognize the pattern clearly enough that hope no longer refills completely the way it once did, no matter how convincing the performance. This is often one of the most painful stages to move through, because it can feel like losing something, even though what's actually happening is the beginning of something far healthier, a slow, hard-won detachment from a hope that was never actually being honored by the person it was extended toward. And this fourth stage is exactly where the real turning point begins to take shape, the shift from oscillation into something that finally, genuinely starts to hold. And understanding what happens in that shift is where we're headed next, because it explains something crucial about why some people finally leave for good, while others stay caught in this cycle for years without ever fully breaking free. That's exactly where we're going next. The turning point, the fifth and final stage that finally shifts oscillation into something permanent, is what I'd call the identity separation. And this is the piece that explains why some people break free for good, while others stay caught in the cycle for years, sometimes decades, without ever fully escaping it. Here's what happens in this stage, and it's subtle enough that most people don't even notice it happening in real time, until they look back and realize something fundamental has changed. Up until this point, every part of the super empath's identity has been tangled up with the relationship itself, with being the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who holds everything together no matter what. Their sense of self has been, in a very real way, dependent on continuing to play that role. Because if they stop being the person who tries harder, who loves deeper, who sees the potential no one else can see, then who are they? This question, unspoken but deeply felt, is exactly what keeps so many super empaths locked into the oscillation phase for so long. Because leaving doesn't just mean losing the relationship. It means losing an entire identity built around a role they've played for years, sometimes their entire life. The identity separation stage is where that fusion finally starts to come apart, where the super empath begins to recognize, often slowly, sometimes through therapy, sometimes through sheer accumulated exhaustion, sometimes through a single moment of clarity that finally sticks instead of fading, that their capacity for empathy, for deep love, for loyalty and understanding, exists independently of this specific relationship. It was never something the narcissist gave them or unlocked in them. It was always theirs, a core part of who they are, capable of being directed toward people who can actually receive and reciprocate it, rather than being permanently tied to proving its worth to someone who has never once treated it as anything other than a resource to extract. This realization changes everything about what leaving actually means, because up until this point, every attempt to leave has carried an implicit sense of loss, of giving something up, of walking away from love itself. But once identity separation happens, leaving stops feeling like abandoning love and starts feeling like finally protecting it, redirecting a capacity that was never actually being honored toward a life. And eventually, people, who might actually be capable of honoring it the way it deserves. This shift in framing from "I'm giving up on love" to "I'm finally protecting what love is supposed to be" is one of the most powerful psychological turning points in this entire journey, because it removes the sense of failure that used to accompany every previous attempt to leave. Now, here's something crucial to understand about the actual day this finally happens. The quiet, undramatic morning we started with today. By the time a super empath reaches that morning, the real work has already been done. The final walking away isn't the hard part. It's almost anticlimactic, in the sense that it doesn't require the same white-knuckled willpower that earlier attempts to leave required, because those earlier attempts were fighting against a fully intact belief system, a fully intact hope, a fully intact identity fusion, all at once. By the time the final morning arrives, all of that has already been slowly, painstakingly dismantled over months or years of oscillation, awakening flickers, exhaustion of hope, and identity separation. What's left isn't a dramatic act of willpower. It's simply the natural, almost inevitable conclusion of a nervous system that has finally, fully caught up to what some part of the super empath knew, on some level, a very long time ago. This is exactly why that final morning looks the way it does. Why there's no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, no slammed door. Because those dramatic elements belong to leaving in crisis, leaving on a peak of emotion that eventually fades. This kind of leaving is different. It's quiet, because it's not being driven by a temporary surge of anger or fear that needs an outlet. It's being driven by a settled, integrated understanding that simply doesn't require external drama to validate itself. The super empath doesn't need to prove anything to the narcissist in that final moment, doesn't need them to understand, doesn't need a satisfying ending where accountability finally gets acknowledged. They've already done the internal work that makes external validation from the narcissist completely unnecessary. I want to address something important here because this entire journey, the overextension, the awakening flicker, the oscillation, the exhaustion of hope, the identity separation, And finally, this quiet last morning can look, from the outside, like it took an unreasonably long time. People who haven't lived through this often ask why it took so long, why the superempath went back so many times, why it wasn't obvious sooner. I want to be really clear about this because it matters enormously for anyone who's in the middle of this process right now, feeling ashamed of how long it's taking, how many times they've already left and returned. This timeline is not a reflection of weakness or foolishness. It's a reflection of exactly how deep and how genuine your capacity for love actually is. The depth of your empathy, the very thing that made you vulnerable to this dynamic in the first place, is the same depth that makes untangling from it take real time. A shallow capacity for connection would have made leaving easier, faster, less costly. Your capacity was never shallow. That's precisely why this took as long as it did, and precisely why, once it's finally, genuinely complete, it holds in a way that a hastier departure never could have. So, if you're somewhere in the middle of this journey right now, if you're in the oscillation phase, exhausted, ashamed of how many times you've gone back, wondering if you'll ever actually reach that quiet, final morning, I want you to hear this clearly. Every cycle you've been through, every time you left and went back, has not been wasted. Each one chipped away, slowly, invisibly, at a belief system that took years to build. And that chipping away is genuine, cumulative progress, even when it doesn't feel like it from inside the cycle. You are not further from that quiet morning than you think. You are, in fact, exactly as far along as your own journey requires you to be. And the depth of love that made this hard is the exact same depth that will eventually make your peace, once you finally reach it, unshakable. If this gave you language for a journey you're still in the middle of, or helped make sense of one you've already completed, know that you're far from the only one who's walked this exact path, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed because we go deeper into this every single week.